more poetry. You folks really got into narrative poetry last week. I have to say, maybe I had a little bit of disappointment in the fact that nobody chose to write about Casey at the Bat that I recall, or to write about the cremation of Sam McGee, but maybe because you didn't have those poems in front of you to read. Now, as I said in last week's video, poetry is really meant to be heard, okay? So, when you read the poems that I'm going to give you this week, read them out loud so you can hear them at the same time, okay? Or, if you really want to get a different kind of effect, I suppose you could Google each of them and listen to a reading of them online. That way you'd get to hear a poem because, a part of the magic of a poem is what's going on. But besides all that, you folks did a really nice job of delving into those poems last week. Certainly, we talked an awful lot about Richard Cory in what you wrote about last week. There was another one that was really, really popular too. It's not popping into my head, but if I look over here. Oh, The Death of the Turret Ball Gunner. Yes, of course. That's almost a hard one not to write about because it really does delve into man's inhumanity to man, and that's pretty frustrating. So anyway, we're going to talk more about poetry today, and today is lyric poetry, okay? Now, I wore kind of a little unusual kind of shirt because we want to talk about poetry, and so I think this kind of shirt helps me envision the whole poetic kind of thing because it's, sure, it's, it is what it is, but it's a little bit psychedelic with the colors and all that stuff too. So, that's to add to. I'm sitting here at my kitchen table today. That's a Trisha Romance picture up behind me. And if you're familiar with Niagara on the Lake, Trisha Romance lives in Niagara on the Lake. She's a really fine artist. And actually, you can see that house in Niagara on the Lake, and she's got a studio in Niagara on the Lake, although she used to have a studio here in Orchard Park, and a lot of her paintings were sold in Orchard Park. I'm not sure if she actually lived in Orchard Park for a while, but anyway, Trisha Romance is a pretty neat painter, and we have, I think, 3 of her pieces. A little story to one of them. One of them is entitled School Days, and she autographed it for us to the Chernowskis. And our son, Joseph, who's our youngest and occasionally teaches a course at Trocaire in theology or philosophy, said that he'd rather that we had vacation days than school days. He said that we got that picture when he was about 5, So typical, Joseph Chernowski, typical kid reaction to the unnamed school days, because let's face it, what kid wouldn't rather have, weekends. He said he'd rather have weekends than school days. That's right. That's a few years ago. I guess I goofed up that story a little bit. Okay, so narrative poem tells a story, okay? And so we saw poems that told stories last week, and you folks did a pretty nice job going through those poems that tell stories, okay? Well, this week we're going to look at lyric poems, and lyric poems are really designed to be emotional, first of all, to move the emotions. Now, all poems, I suppose, can be emotions. So, narrative poems can certainly be emotions. Like, I think Casey at the Bat is a terribly emotional poem. I think Richard Cory is a terribly emotional poem. I think The Death of the Turret Ball Gunner is a terribly emotional poem, So certainly, poems that tell a story can also be emotional. Okay? But lyrical poems are written kind of specifically to move the emotions. And if they tell a story, they do. But usually it's story coming from within. But again, just as we've talked about with every piece of literature, keep in mind that with a poem, its value is what it does to you, not the poet, but you. Okay? So in choosing poems to write about this week, allow yourself to be submersed in that poem so that you can tell what's going on in you, not the poet, but in you. Okay, so lyrical poems are meant again to be emotional. They're also meant to be subjective. So it's the poet pretty much writing from in here. Well, okay, so are you necessarily going to have the same thoughts the poet had? Probably not. And should you struggle with the thoughts the poet had? Probably not. Rather, I'd really like you, again, to work on hearing the poems out loud and monitoring what's happening for you in here and in here as you read these poems, because we're dealing with poems that are meant to be emotional and subjective and imaginative, okay? So lyrical poems are meant to be emotional, subjective, and imaginative. I'm going to give you your question right now for this week's video question, and you can text me the answer to this. Briefly tell me the difference between narrative poetry and lyric poetry, okay? Briefly tell me the difference, or tell me what narrative poetry is as opposed to lyrical poetry. However you want to do it, or again, answer that in a sentence or two. It's pretty simple, but I want to make sure you grasp those two things, because today we're dealing with poetry that is not really meant to tell a story. It's not its prime purpose. Its prime purpose is to be emotional, subjective, and imaginative. So allow yourself to become immersed in it, because poetry is meaningless if it isn't meaningful to you, the reader. So you're doing a great job on this. Now, I know, time schedules are messed up. School isn't really opening again until, I don't know, Thursday maybe, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st. Thursday or Friday, school opens again this week. And I'm looking for you to get these to me on, I guess Monday the 25th, same as usual. So I don't know if we're losing a week or not here. Doesn't matter. I'm trying to give you extra time to get to it. That's why I'm doing this on Holy Saturday, in fact, so that then I can send you an email and say, okay, the video's up and the lesson is up and the assignment is up. So if you want to get started, hopefully you have a little bit more time this week than you will down the road, okay? Also, if you haven't yet, let me know if there's a day of the week or whatever, nighttime, daytime, that's best for you to try to get together. Let me know that, because I would really like to get to meet all of you. And so if we can work that out, that would really be nice. So anyway, let me know that too when you respond to my email. If you have when you send me your text, if you haven't already done so. Okay. So now I'm going to give you the poems that I want you to read and the pages that they're on. Okay. And I'm going to give them to you in blocks of 3. Okay. You're going to be asked to write about 3 poems the way that 3 poems hit you, so really I suppose, and I'll explain this probably in the assignment, is that what you'll probably need is 3 paragraphs. But if you want 5 paragraphs where you have an introductory and a concluding, that's fine. It kind of makes the whole thing roll together very neatly. So here's the poems, and write these down, because I am not putting them in the printed assignment this week. Because there's 1 or 2 people who tend not to try to watch the video as they do this. And you know what? That's not fair to the rest of you, because almost everybody is watching the video, But there's a few people that don't. And so this week they have to. So write these down. I'll give you the names of the poems, the poets, and the pages that they're on. Okay? And I'm going to give them to you, as I say, in blocks of 3, okay? and I'll ask you to write about one from each of those three blocks because they are three rather different blocks of poems. Okay, so the first poem is one that really you hear parts of in wedding ceremonies fairly frequently. Okay, and it is Elizabeth Barrett's Browning, How Do I Love Thee? Let Me Count the Ways. How Do I Love Thee by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. It's in your text on page 929. Okay, so How Do I Love Thee by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, page 929. A little background to that poem. Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning were two poets, and they wrote letters to each other. Elizabeth Barrett was actually in a wheelchair, but they wrote letters to each other and ultimately came to meet each other and then married. So Elizabeth Barrett became Elizabeth Barrett Browning, married to the poet Robert Browning. Okay, so it's pretty appropriate that you get phrases from that poem in wedding ceremonies. So that's one. Robert Burns is another poet, and he wrote the poem A Red, Red Rose. Okay. My love is like a red, red rose. You've all heard that. Well, okay, this is the poem. It's a really pretty short poem, and that's on page 528. So that's Robert Burns is the poet. A Red, Red Rose is the poem, and it's on page 528. Okay, and the third is a poem that I would bet you've all heard before. It's by Edgar Allan Poe. We all know Edgar Allan Poe, great poet, known more for his short stories, spooky, but the name of the poem is Annabelle Lee. It was many, many years ago in a kingdom by the sea that a maiden there lived, whom you may know by the name of Annabelle Lee, and she lived, excuse me, and she loved with, that poem. I'm losing my voice here. Let me grab some coffee. My adult beverage that I like to have. Okay. So Annabelle Lee by Edgar Allan Poe. Okay, now, it was many, many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabelle Lee. And she loved with a love that was more than a love, with a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. And I'm not going to go on with it because you're going to read it, okay? But it's on page 954 in your book. So in block A, we have these three love poems. How Do I Love Thee by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, A Red, Red Rose by Robert Burns, and Annabelle Lee by Edgar Allan Poe. It's hard to picture him as little Eddie Poe, isn't it? Okay, three more poems then in block B, which are really kind of there's similarities amongst them, but they are different. So you're going to have to choose one from the love poem group, those first three, and then one from the second group. Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night by Dylan Thomas. If you saw the movie Back to School, Rodney Dangerfield did an incredible job on this poem. Okay, but Dylan Thomas wrote Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, and it's on page 681. And it's a poem that really does tug at the heartstrings, and it's somebody who's saying to his father, don't just fade away, don't just let yourself die, keep fighting. It's a beautiful poem. It's on 681, Dylan Thomas, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. And then Emily Dickinson wrote a ton of poems. But this one is pretty cool. Tell All the Truth, but Tell It Slant. Okay. And it is on page 738 in your book, Emily Dickinson, Tell All the Truth, on page 738. And then a poem that I also had in the list of narrative poems for you, but it's also an incredibly emotional poem, I guess especially for an old guy, because we old guys who are still really doing in our lives, because some people are rocking chair old guys, and I'm not a rocking chair old guy. And so, in Ulysses, when you get to the end of it especially, the emotional level is so high because he's saying to your friends, we can still go, And so I love that because I have a lot of friends that are my age, or older and still want to do. It's really cool. I'm so lucky. So anyway, Ulysses by Tennyson, Alfred Lord Tennyson, and it's on page 922. So that's is that 3? Do Not Go Gentle, Tell All the Truth. Yeah, and Ulysses by Tennyson. So that's the second block of 3 that I want you to choose one from. Okay? So again, Do Not Go Gentle by Dylan Thomas on 681. Tell All the Truth by Emily Dickinson on 738. And Ulysses by Tennyson in 922. And then the third block is a couple of them by Robert Frost. In fact, all 3 of them by Robert Frost, because I think Robert Frost is such a well-known and influential American poet that you should be somewhat familiar with Robert Frost, and so all 3 of these poems are Robert Frost poems, and I'll want you to write about one of these 3. One of them is The Road Not Taken, and it really is, in a sense, a pattern for what we do every day in life, because every day we have choices to make, and sometimes we wonder, okay, I chose this, but if I would have chosen that, what might have happened? Well, that's what this poem is kind of all about. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth, then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim. And you've all read that poem somewhere along the line. Well, anyway, that's on page 760 in your book, The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. Okay. Then there's the poem Mending Wall, and Mending Wall is all of Robert Frost. No, many of Robert Frost's poems are really very famous. But Mending Wall ends with good fences make good neighbors. And of course, that's a line that you would probably have come across in different places. If you haven't read this poem before, once you read it, you'll know where that line comes from. Mending Wall, that's on 763. And again, Robert Frost, okay? And then Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening on page 768, Stopping by the Woods. And it's the poet or the narrator in that poem is deep in concentration, looking into a dark woods, okay? Now, think about, if you want to, think about the symbolism of a dark woods, and see if that affects you, and see this narrator contemplating whatever he might be contemplating, looking into this dark woods, if that's what gets to you. On the other hand, it's about a guy who is out with his horse pulling his sleigh, and he stops and looks into the dark woods, on a snowy evening, and it's like, well, he looks, but, it's like, let's go. So, there's different ways you can go. I'm not trying to tell you the direction you should take on that. I'm just trying to maybe throw some ideas out to you with some of these poems, because they're all really well-known poems. They're poems that really probably you've heard of all of them before. I'm getting a little long-winded here. We're almost 19 minutes into this video, and I don't like them to be that long. So anyway, I've given you 9 poems, and so 3 blocks of 3, the 3 love poems, the Thomas, Emily Dickinson, and Tennyson poem in the second block of 3, and then the Robert Frost poem in the third block of 3. So you're going to be asked in your assignment to choose one from each block, and tell how it hits you, because we're looking for these poems to get to you. So if somebody can read them to you, good. Read each poem at least twice, because you have to get into them, okay? And then, so by, Monday the 25th, that would be great. If you want to do it early, that's even better, because my wife's having surgery on Monday the 25th, so I'll be sitting in the hospital for many hours while she's in surgery. She's having her shoulder replaced, so it's like, if you get there early, if you get that stuff early, that's great for me, but Go by your schedule, not mine. Don't worry about me. Anyway, it's Holy Saturday, so I'm going to send you an email telling you this is up there. Have a great Easter. Enjoy the rest of your vacay. I wanted to get this early in case it gives you a little more time. And let me know. And of course, you got the video question. Let me know about any time you might be able to get together. Okay? Thanks.